Yeah, so Malcolm, he's won 3 Walkley Awards. He's won a Human Rights Award. That does not surprise me. His novels include Summerland, A Private Man, winner of the Ned Kelly Award, Jamaica, which won the Colin Roderick Award and was shortlisted in the 2008 Prime Minister's Literary Awards. The Life, The Wonder Lover, which, I mean, just the title makes me want to read it. And Bluebird, which I've read. They're his other novels. His many non-fiction titles include Boom, The Underground History of Australia, From Gold Rush to GFC, which won the 2013 Ashurst Business Literature Prize, and Bradman's War, shortlisted in the 2013 Prime Minister's Literary Awards, so twice listed for the Prime Minister's Literary Awards. I mean, let's give him a hand. So how lucky are we? So we're here to talk about The First Friend, his latest novel, which I only just finished a few days ago, and I've got to say, it is the most beautiful love story about a man, a husband and wife who will do anything to protect their children, as you do. That's the heart of the novel, and it's high stakes, you know, it's life, death. It's a page turner, and the ending is like, anyhow, I can't give anything away. So that's one level of the book, and the other level is that it's an alarm bell just ringing so loudly because we need to wake up to what's happening in our world politically at the moment. So it is so relevant. And personally, I think that as artists, whether we be painters or musicians, writers, at present we need to step up to the mark and do our job. And I just want to say thank you, Malcolm, for doing your job with this book.
Thank you, Donna. That's a really generous introduction. Thanks.
Thank you. For those in the audience who haven't read the book, do you want to give us your pitch?
I can't do any better than your pitch. It's set, of all places, it's set in the Republic of Georgia on the Black Sea in 1938, which is not really my usual neighbourhood. But look, as you say, in a nutshell, it's about preserving the relationships that are most important to us in times where it is, even domestic relationships are under attack from the outside. And the essence of the relationship in this book, it's a kind of a 3-part friendship between our main character, Vasil Murtov, who's the driver and henchman for essentially a mafia boss. His mafia boss, his name is Lavrenti Beria, who's based on a real person who was the mafia boss who ran the Republic of Georgia for 7 years in the 1930s, and then he became Joseph Stalin's head of secret police and chief axeman from 1938 to 1953. The third main character is Murtov's wife, Babylina, who's what you would call a former person in the Soviet Union. She was an academic, a literature academic, who cancelled herself before she was going to get cancelled by the state. The essence of what's in this...
And my favourite character, I've got to say.
In this, and they have 2 daughters. And Beria, according to the historical record, what we know, Beria was among many of his crimes, he was an unpunished pedophile who had a taste for young girls. They have 2 young girls reaching the age of danger. Murtov and Beria have been best friends for their entire lives. Beria was adopted into Murtov's family. Murtov was the alpha male. As boys, Beria was the impoverished kid who was adopted into a wealthy family. This friendship between these 2 boys was completely flipped on its head by the revolution, where a person like Beria became the person in control and with his hands on the levers of power, whereas Murtov was lucky to survive. A bourgeois boy from a wealthy family, he suddenly becomes Beria's manservant and fixer. So for Murtov, the challenge is to keep Beria believing that he is a bit dumb, very loyal to him, and for Murtov, the job is to protect himself, to protect Babylina, to protect their daughters, in a world where you can't say what you mean. So even at home, Murtov and Babylina have to communicate in codes because of the threat of listening devices in every room of their house. So you've got a kind of a game of trust going on where Babylina thinks Murtov has a plan to look after them, to keep them safe. Murtov can't quite spell it out to her because that would put her in danger. So she has to think, well, how far can I trust him? Is he as dumb as he looks? Beria, the whole plan relies on Beria thinking Murtov is as dumb as he looks. Does Beria really believe that, or does Beria know that Murtov's up to something? The situation that the story is set in, it was a real situation in 1938. Stalin was a Georgian, Beria was a Georgian. Stalin came back to Georgia, not very often, but he came back in 1938 for an anniversary event to celebrate his ascent to power back in the 1920s. Beria is given responsibility for constructing the big party for Stalin. And a lot of the book takes place in this atmosphere of waiting and getting ready for the big boss's visit. And Beria's character arc through the book is a very steady descent into madness, and so Beria is becoming more and more dangerous, and therefore for the people we care about, the risks are getting higher and higher.
Yeah, and it's all based on fact. So what was the inspiration, the trigger for this book? Do you remember the moment it arrived? Did you know that it was going to be set in Stalinist Russia 1938, like from the start, or how did it happen?
No, I only found myself down that rabbit hole once I was there and was unable to get out. It certainly wasn't planned. In my mind, so I've always, friendship, and very often male friendship, but also friendship between men and women had always been what I am most interested in as a novelist, and how friendships survive and how they change with external changes. One person suddenly becomes rich, one person suddenly becomes bankrupt. Outside forces flip friendships. How do those relationships survive? I've never been very good at romance,
I would disagree, actually.
But friendship's my thing, and I'd felt a little bit with my previous novel Bluebird that I'd got to the end of friendships set in domestic environments where, well, what's at stake there? It's the loss of it's a divorce. It's the loss of a house. It's a rupture of a parent-child relationship. It's something happening to the kids at school. I was a bit restless to up the stakes, and so my original picture was for a gangster story, a buddy story in a gangster setting.
Set in Australia?
Set anywhere. I wasn't even thinking about setting at that point. All I could picture was these two people sitting in cars, spending a lot of time sitting in cars, talking about stuff, and they're
two old friends.
Old friends post a situation where their friendship dynamic has been flipped.
Shifted, yeah.
Yeah. That was really all I knew, and I could see and hear conversations, I could hear voices, and I just wanted to get get those voices down, and it was always going to be a bit of a voice novel. I actually get, I don't know about you, but I get, in a lot of books I read, say crime fiction, I really love the world building stage of crime novels. You know, who are the characters? What's the world they live in? You know, what's at stake? All of that. But once it becomes car chases and you know, are they going to blow the person out of the building or not? I lose interest. I think.
More interested in the psychology.
I'm much more interested in the psychology, and as I say, in world building, and because I don't think most of us live amid car chases and gunfights, and all of those action things in our lives tend to happen off stage. You know, unless you're a woman having a child, say, for instance, that's very much on stage. But you know, my experience is sitting in the next room or going to the next room or telling everybody about it afterwards and what a hero I was to bring,
which is what my father did apparently.
To bring
to him and had 5 children.
Yeah, you know, I've watched 2 childbirths and you know talked about them a lot, and I'm always the central character of the story. So I wanted very much a novel about people just after the big gunfight or just before the big car chase, and how they feel anticipation and how they feel reflection and relief, or you know any of the emotions that come out of action. So to go back to your question, I was thinking gangsters because I want the stakes to be more life and death.
Yeah.
And then I thought at one point, well, what about a whole country that is a gangster country? And you know, to me, the first one that came to mind was Stalinist Russia, which was run along the lines of a mafia business. And this was about 2020 when you know, we talk a lot about toxic masculinity. I was thinking, well, who's the most toxic male I can think of anywhere? And you know, that's the president of Russia.
Or the United States.
Well, at that moment, I think the president of the United States was on the way out, and I certainly didn't think we'd be seeing him again. But there did feel like there was this stacking in the broader world. There was this stacking up of. You know, we had Morrison here, we still had Trump in America, we had Putin, we had Xi Jinping, we had Modi in India. So the strongman, we were in at, I thought, peak strongman politics in our world. I didn't know that 4 years later, you know, that peak looked like a Everest base camp compared to what we were then going to move into. But yeah, the politics of strongman culture, which is again a gangster kind of ethos, was the world that began to accumulate around these characters, and Babylina was in there from the beginning, and then, you know, before I knew it, I felt I was in Soviet Russia. And
then it just came to you.
Well, I was too far in, as I say, and I couldn't get out, even if I'd wanted to get out, which I didn't by then. But yeah, it just seemed not only the essence of the gangster state, where little domestic issues between people, you know, every turn could be fatal. Not only that, but I don't know. It brings back funny emotions to recall that time. I wrote a lot of the book when I was in hotel quarantine and locked up and totally isolated.
Yeah, right.
I wasn't feeling scared, but I could really imagine people who were scared. You forget that kind of fear that was saturating, that was something that we had not known before and not known since.
So did the Stalin element come in like second draft, or was this all pre-planning and then it happened and then you started writing, or?
Yeah, I can't really answer that because I can't quite remember.
Cool, fair enough.
It was kind of organic, but
wow.
you're also looking for ways, and I think we still are, ways to make sense of what's going on.
Yeah.
And now in 2025, even more than then.
Well, I got to say, I think your book, Elizabeth Gilbert talks about big magic, and I've been reading Malcolm's book in the last few weeks on and off, and Trump and Elon Musk have been unfolding. And there were days, and I kid you not, the day that Trump said that he was going to turn the Gaza Strip into the Middle Eastern Riviera, I read a line in Malcolm's book. Beria, the, what is he, the leader of the police or...
Yeah, well, at the time of the book, Beria is actually the governor of
Georgia.
The Transcaucasia, so Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, which were amalgamated. He was the governor, so he had pretensions certainly to being Stalin's successor. He'd come up through the ranks as a spy, one of those grey presences who just disappeared into the background. And I'll let you get to his line because I want to know what it was too. But
I've created the Soviet Florida.
Yeah.
That was the line I read the same day that I read that Trump said that, and I was, what the hell? Big magic.
I hadn't thought about that, but that was a line,
That's not the only line that happened.
Yeah, it's incredible, isn't it, that the Soviet Union, and we'll probably talk a bit about research, but with a lot of the Soviet Union, you can just write it straight, and it reads as the kind of weird, black farce that we're living through with the US at the moment. And the Soviet Florida was Beria's claim to have created that, while Stalin was sending the rest of the Soviet Union into a very dark time. Georgia was the land of milk and honey.
Because he's under all this pressure. He's getting this seaside village ready for the return of Stalin. Stalin's coming to visit, so he's really freaked out to get it all. He basically destroys the town and rebuilds it, and that's what that line is about. But just the parallels that kept happening while I was reading your book. I just wonder, there's this whole idea about tapping into the, Jung says the archetypal subconscious, and even though that you didn't know Trump was going to get back in, it is incredible how these things happen.
Well, like I say, certain things you can just write straight from history, and I'm sure people will be doing this in a few years' time, writing the history of the Trump period. Stalin, as they were preparing Georgia for Stalin's arrival, it was dictated that Stalin must be referred to the shining sun, S-U-N, the shining sun of the Soviet century, and greater than the sun, for the sun has not wisdom. That was actually serious. That's not something I made up. And
well, that brings me to my next question.
Well, you can see that the shining sun of the American century and greater than the sun, for the sun has not wisdom. Next, I would say. That's, after the Gulf of America.
So, are all the characters based on historical figures? And what were the really interesting things you found in your research?
So I don't know. Beria is probably the place to start there. I don't know how familiar you are with Lavrenti Beria, because he was a major person in the 20th century who became airbrushed out of it, and something of a man of mystery. He was born in Georgia in poor circumstances in 1899. He wanted to be an architect and an oil engineer as a kid. He went to school in Georgia. He went to university in Baku in Azerbaijan, which was one of the oil capitals of the world. Then the revolution hit, and he became a spy, and he really found his lifelong gift as a person who played both sides in the revolution as a spy. The Russian Revolution hit the Caucasus a little bit later, about 3-4 years after the revolution in Russia in 1917. Georgia didn't fall to the Bolsheviks until 1921. By that time, Beria was positioned perfectly to rise through the Cheka, the secret police, and he spent a decade of his 20s doing that, perfecting the art. He really did believe he was smarter than everybody else, and this ended up being a pretty common assessment of Beria. The Americans who met him said of all Stalin's Politburo, Beria was the one they imagined who had the skills to run a medium to large size American corporation. And because he was so smart, that put himself in danger, because you weren't allowed to be smarter than Stalin. But he was also a very ruthless man, so it's not really giving anything away. At the end of this book, Beria gets the promotion he wants. He's called up from Georgia to Moscow to be part of the central, part of Stalin's Politburo. But at the same time, it's a demotion, because Stalin puts him back into the secret police, and Stalin's saying, you can come to be part of my gang, but I'm going to make you a backroom killer, which is what you're good at, and not the great ruler, which is what you aspire to be. Mm-hmm. Following the events of the story, Beria, he ran the Second World War for the Soviet Union. He ran more than a dozen different departments, from religion to the Gulag, and everything in between. He was then given supervision of the atomic bomb project. It was after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Stalin realised, oh hell, we're in trouble here, and he had to give that project to the one person who could get stuff done, and that was Beria in 1945.
Did you ever feel like you were channeling him, or?
Well, I'll get to that.
Okay.
That's a really interesting question. But just to finish off the biographical stuff, by 1949 he'd given Stalin his atomic bomb. By 1953 he'd given him the hydrogen bomb. In 1953, when Stalin died, not much is known about this. Beria became effectively the ruler of the Soviet Union for about 100 days before his mates knocked him off. All of his own files were destroyed. He personally destroyed all of Stalin's files. Nearly everything we know about Beria is based on unreliable second, third, fourth, fifth-hand information. He is a real man of mystery, and there's still, I don't know if you can call it debate. I can't ever see him being rehabilitated, but there is a fair bit of doubt about certain accusations towards Beria, because he became the scapegoat after he was killed in 1953, and Khrushchev rose to power. Beria was the boogeyman who had done everything wrong, as Stalin's operative. So that's the key to the historical side, which I've probably stayed pretty faithful to. Murtov himself is a fictional character.
Okay.
Babylina is a fictional character. There was a wealthy family that Beria was adopted by when he was a child. They were all wiped out, as far as we know. They were all wiped out in 1917 to 1920. I've kept the brother alive, and the brother's girlfriend who becomes his wife. So our emotional centre in the book are people I've made up.
And the father?
and the father.
There's a beautiful scene with the
Murtaugh's
father.
Yeah.
That's one of the most moving scenes in the book, actually, I found.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. Look, a lot of that stuff is really based on my own relationships. Stalin's mother is pretty closely based on my mother. And if you've read
she's a real character.
if you've read the book, you'll see Stalin's mother is a hoot. So a lot of these things, you feel in.
I take it Mum's not here.
Mum's not a reader. But she shows the book off to her friends. So you're asking whether I channel Beria. Look, I hope not. I think I channel Murtaugh because my kind of
meeting you're definitely Murtaugh. You're not a Beria.
Yeah, I've always thought in life I've always been a bit of a kind of a second banana. In my friendships, I'm often the kind of the henchman more than the alpha guy, and that probably flows through nearly all of my fiction.
Yeah, well, Bluebird, which is the book before this one, and I read it because it could be Kilcare Beach. It's set on this little coastal peninsula. It's full of local characters and around the surf club, and I could just see Killy as I was reading it. And Gordon is the everyman, just like Murtaugh. I could see a lot of similarities with those two, and the relationship between Murtaugh and Babylina, it had echoes of Gordon and Kelly for me as well. And it's so lovely to read a book that deals with, I suppose I'm biased because I'm at that part in my life, the long-term relationship, the kids are getting older, you're looking at each other going, wow, we've been together for a while now. The kids are going to leave us and, do we still want to stay together? Is this... It's much easier to fall in love and be all passionate and romantic at the beginning, but 30 years down the track, there's a different energy there, and I love that about your books, how you explore that kind of middle-aged relationship with long-term,
Yeah, and I think I'm constitutionally a bit gutless. Like Murtaugh, and Murtaugh goes into what was in Soviet Russia known
he's the quiet hero. He's actually a quiet hero.
Yeah, well, I'd like to think that, but also gutless. He goes into an internal. It was known as the internal migration, where
he is very passive. Gordon's very passive. Yeah, almost frustratingly so. But they have these really strong women that kind of. Pick up the pieces. So.
Yeah, well, that's my good fortune as well. My gutlessness is certainly compensated for by my wife. But to finish your question about Beria, and what do you take from your own life? I'd only had one experience, I reckon, where I had an ongoing relationship with somebody I called evil, a really evil person, and the Beria I've built, and from everything we know, the Beria who lived was as near as you can find to a human being who practices the arts of evil, and part of that is.
I had to Google his image. I just had to see what he looked like.
He's bald, so maybe that was why you asked me. But he enjoys having his board or the committee around him, and he loves playing them off against each other. This is what Stalin did as well. He loved a room where one person is copying it, and everybody else is laughing. But their laughter is tinged with, am I going to be next? And it was me last week. I'm laughing because, it's somebody else this week. And I did know somebody like that. And I was talking with a friend about this person over dinner one night, and I said, well, I knew him but I didn't know him that well. I was a little bit too junior in our organisation to really have a front row seat. So I can't, remember quite that well firsthand. And she said, "Why don't you do a bit of research?" And I interviewed something like 30 or 40 people who had known this guy and worked for this guy, and their stories about him. And this was 20 years later. They loved talking about him. They loved telling stories about how horrible he'd been. And there's a few Berrier things in the book that came out of those interviews. Of course, this guy wasn't a murderer, but he was like that strong man. And this was the case in our organisation. He was the strong man who really was evil with, played like a
power hungry
cat with a mouse.
Yeah.
But he was also fantastic at that job, and he was forgiven so much because he was the best. He was the best leader that anybody had known in all the years since. He was the most effective. He was certainly very charismatic, and he, like these ruthless people, he could make people feel as fantastic as he could make them feel like they, like their life was over, and he knew his power to press people's buttons. And I just felt the more I got into that, the more I thought of, there are these strong women too, but certainly going into the past, strong men in clubs, surf clubs, in families, in companies of whatever size. There are these types who are so good at what they do, and also so very, very cruel.
Yes, you really do explore the worst of human nature, and the structure of the book is really interesting. There's an inherent tension because the prologue, the opening, is actually the death scene. It's a flash forward to the death scene, which is the end of the book. And then the chapter headings are like 40 days to live, 29 days to live. It's a countdown. The writer in me was so intrigued. Did that happen naturally in the writing, or was that a last-minute editorial decision, the beautiful structure of your book?
This is going to sound really weird, but
I love all the big magic stuff. Let's go there.
This is just absurd. I'd written a lot of the book, and I didn't have that beginning yet. And then Shane Warne died, and some of you might know that I was a cricket writer, and I knew Shane Warne fairly well, and was quite affected by that his passing. But the thing that I couldn't get out of my head was just picturing the scene where this person is in a luxury hotel on his own, but the last people he laid eyes on in his life were three masseurs who came into his room and gave him three women masseurs. I
didn't know that.
Yeah. Clearly, it wasn't a happy ending. But
he didn't go out with a bang.
I just found that really, really poignant. That the sadness of and the loneliness of that this is what somebody of that stature and who'd given people so much joy and had actually done a whole lot of good in the world beyond their stardom, and used their stardom in many ways for good. I found that terribly sad, and that was when I wrote the opening scene. Obviously, he's not Shane Warne, but the loneliness of the person in the hotel who thinks he's about to die, and the last the last people he sees or thinks he sees, the last person he thinks he sees is a woman come in to service him, which is a joke being played on him by his evil best friend Beria. It was all set up there.
But there's a wonderful twist at the end. So
but the origin of it was that emotional point.
Okay,
As a
and
writer,
so that
you
came
would
quite
know,
late.
Things just hit you very hard, and suddenly they fill a gap that's been floating around in your head for a while, waiting for that emotion to arrive to fill it.
Yeah, so just getting back to that idea, how relevant this book is now. Publishing things move so slowly, so you would have written this book at least 2 years ago. You had no idea that Trump was going to get back in power. Were there any big magic moments apart from that in the writing of the book where you just felt like you were channeling Beria, or any other thing that happened that?
A lot of these things occur subconsciously, and just if you have your eyes and ears open, they can't not come in. And one thing I was feeling, and I work as a journalist, and I feel there's even more now. It's a sense of being overwhelmed by just by too much coming in, and no anchor points to refer to test whether what's real, what's not real, what just looks like it's real. And remember, this is during the pandemic where that feeling of being overwhelmed was supercharged because we were isolated so much, and as we were isolated, we were looking at our phones more, and all of that stuff. And this has only got to a higher and higher pitch since Trump's second election. And again, that was one of the things that, the Soviet Union, it's a mistake if you think in the Soviet Union people were kept in the dark, were kept starved of information. The front page of Pravda every day would have the latest production figures, the latest harvest figures. It was an information-dense environment people were living and people were having forced upon them. Now, probably 95% of the people knew this is all bullshit. This is, we're being played with, but they were being disabled by the overwhelming of the information, not by the starving of information. And that was one of those things where, as I was writing it, I was thinking, I am writing about the here and now, because we're living in an age of overload, and of course we know a lot of people who don't watch the news anymore, don't read newspapers anymore. They need to escape. And I speak to people every week who say, I can't watch anything anymore. And of course that was the aim, and it is the aim of most authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. They want you to switch off. They just want you to focus on the next step you're taking, and my family around me, and I'm just going to shut myself off and try to get through to the end of the day or the end of the week, without being sent mad.
And it's even more frightening now.
That was what that world was about.
Yeah, wow, that's so interesting, the overload, because I was lucky enough to hear Geraldine Doog speak last weekend, and she talks about the fact that we used to all sit down and watch the news at 7 o'clock or whatever, and it just doesn't happen anymore. We're not all seeing the same news and then discussing that input. We've got these personalised feeds, and since the release of AI, Like, I'm personally really frightened about the state of the world, and I feel that maybe democracy might be dead because, companies like Cambridge Analytica, which got Trump in the first place. Do you know about that? Yeah, so I watched this incredible documentary. Cambridge Analytica was this company that worked with social media organisations funded by, the Republicans, or one of the many companies they worked for. And then they would target susceptible voters until they started pressing the angry button, and then they knew we flipped them, and they'd do it state by state. And this incredible, brave whistleblower, this young woman, she secretly recorded interviews, with Republican representatives saying, "Yep, we've won that state for you. We'll move on to this state. You've won the election," and by like 1% or 2%. And then the Brazilian guy got in. Brexit. They worked for Brexit. I mean, the whole company, because of the whistleblower, was disbanded. But I have no doubts that other companies have stepped into that void.
Yeah.
And so it's even more frightening, because with AI and fake news, do you think that democracy is dead? Do you think we're smart enough to see past all of this?
Look, I don't know. None of us knows. But what you made me think of, this doesn't really answer your question at all, but it's as a novelist, you also remember for all of this vast machinery and the technological complexity that is set in motion, decisions are just made by people sitting in rooms. Trump's just a guy in a room, and Trump has lunch with Gina Reinhart, and Gina Reinhart says, "Yeah, we're getting everybody back from, I'm sick of people working from home, they're bludging, we're getting everybody back in the office." Trump thinks that's a great idea, so he signs an executive order saying everybody has to stop working from home. Things emerge in that's how totalitarian regimes operate. Of course, there's the machinery of mass re-engineering of media, for example. But things also just originate as thought bubbles by simple people in recognisable places who are in a bad mood today, and they'll do something that comes from a they're having a dark moment. And a lot of what Stalin did, and the more we read about Stalin, there have been some great histories that emerged in the early 21st century that humanised Stalin away from this previous picture of the remote commander of the giant Soviet industrial machine, that he was just a guy in a room subject to pretty wild mood swings, who ran the country like a really bad father.
Yeah, well, that brings me to my next question, which we haven't spoken about. Is the book's actually quite funny. The irony in the book is funny, and it's the voice of the book, I think, that makes it funny. It's actually really contemporary, kind of ochre Australian, set in Stalinist Russia. And the line that really cracked me up, I can't remember now if it was Beria or the Nikola Yesov character. They'd done all these really schizophrenic things, and then he's talking about someone else, and he says, "I've never seen anyone so schizo." And he's actually the dwarf. The dwarf character is called a dwarf. The political incorrectness in this book was so refreshing, and I want to know, how did you get away with that? Because my last book, the editor took out even the word freak. I couldn't use the word freak. The political correctness was it. And there were points where I had to go above her to my publisher and say, "Look, can we keep this? Like, really? How did you get away with it?
Well, those characters. There's somebody who wrote a line. I can't remember who. It might have been Solzhenitsyn who talked about the joy of life for people who have the freedom to destroy millions. And you see clips of these people, not so much Stalin, but there's occasional clips that emerge in that grainy old footage of Stalin's Politburo arriving at meetings, including Yezhov, who was one of the
going home to Google
butchers of human history, and they're laughing their heads off. They're just fellas arriving at lunch knowing they're going to have a great afternoon because they can do anything. They have absolute power, and they wouldn't ring true if they had an editor in this shadow world, an editor saying you can't say this, you can't say that. Well, these are people to whom nobody said you can't do this until Papa Stalin said it, and then they were done. So they were making lives as fun as they could before the axe fell. The particular dialect you're talking about was intentional because Georgia was to the Soviet Union what Australia is to the American Empire. You hear people in New York and LA saying, "Oh, Australia, I'd love to go there one day. It's this it's this utopia where nothing bad happens and the sun's always shining." That is how Russians spoke of Georgia. I'd love to go there one day, and it did have sunshine. It had beaches. It still does. It was a kind of an idealised world for people in the north, and it also produced, in this weird way, it produced the top men, just as Australia has produced its own little emperor who went and lived in London and then moved to New York and runs the world from there. And he might think he's an American because he's got American citizenship, as Stalin de-Georgianised himself, but everybody there knows him as an Australian, and the otherness of that ruler is a very kind of powerful thing, because they can, to some degree, the Russians, like the Americans, could say afterwards, it wasn't us, it was this lunatic from Georgia, just as the Germans, after 1945 said, it wasn't us, it was this Austrian lunatic. It's very often somebody from the fringe, from the outside, who becomes that lightning rod.
And the whole idea about rewriting history, which again, Beria asks Murtov to change a date because it didn't fit in with his history, and there's this beautiful line. He says, "It felt as easy as moving a chair from a dark corner into a nice patch of sunlight." So it just changes history like that. And the day I read that was the day Trump said, "Oh, Ukraine started the war." Again, just, the parallels were incredible. Do you have hope for humanity? Just end on a really good question. Get your questions ready. We're going to ask you guys to ask Malcolm questions in a minute. Don't feel pressured. Do you think we're inherently compassionate and, empathetic, or?
Yeah, of course I do. You can't keep going if you don't have hope. And I've got children, and I think my children are better people than I am. So, most people who have children, they're a lot taller than they are. So there's always hope. I saw this kind of dodging the question a little bit. Pankaj Mishra, who's one of the really great writers in the world on Asia, and he's written a book about Gaza, and if any of you want the final word or the one book to read about Gaza, look for Pankaj Mishra. And, he gave this gloomy 1 hour talk in Sydney, and it was just terrible because he was linking together bits of authoritarianism from everywhere and showing us how we've got to this point in the Middle East. And at the end, the interviewer said, "Do you have hope for the world?" and he nearly fell over. He was a pool of misery. And then he got up and he said, "I do have hope genuinely in the next generation. They are laden with so much less baggage than us. There are so many things in the world, and not time to go through now, that are much, much better in our world than they used to be." And we're talking about Trump and the terrible things he does. Stalin was a person who was responsible for the deaths of 20 to 30 million during his lives. Trump is not doing that. Who knows what the results of the climate policies will be? But this was an age of industrial scale murder and brutality, and we're talking about metaphors and parallels. We're not talking about history repeating itself.
Yeah. So in light of that, because you write non-fiction and fiction, which do you think is the more powerful vehicle to move people, make people think?
To me, non-fiction has more power to make people think, but fiction has more power to make people feel. And revolutions are, and change is made from feeling as much as thinking. And, I do both because, we always need to focus on both for our individual well-being. So I'm not talking about my own writing, but I can just say what I read. I read pretty promiscuously between fiction and non-fiction and everything else, and they all have power when done by the best.
Yeah.
Can I just butt in now?
Yeah.
We need to wind it up now.
Yeah.
Maybe just time for one question.
I can do more than one, but your timetable might.
I thought this session ended 2:45.
No, 2:30.
Oh, sorry.
No, 2:45. Am I pulling this up way too quiet? Oh my God. Sorry.
Okay.
We can stage a revolution. We can make that clock go back 15 minutes.
But let's open it up for questions. Does anyone have questions for Malcolm?
My question, Malcolm, is how do you go through the process of your split personality in writing fiction and journalism and fiction, non-fiction rather? Do you move easily from one to the other, or do you have different processes for those?
Definitely different processes, but I've got to say I've never quite considered myself a real proper journalist, and I see people like Kate McClymont and Nick McKenzie and so many others who I regard as proper journalists, whereas I've been a bit of a dilettante. I write a lot of stuff that's pretty playful and wearing masks and using techniques of fiction. So a lot of it blurs, and I do a lot of hard research form of fiction. So it's not quite a split personality, I hope. And there are plenty of people I've written journalism about, and they've said, "Well, there's a fiction writer." It's a balanced diet, isn't it? It's veggies and things other than veggies, and we all know once you become a monomaniac, you're on a bit of a downhill spiral, and particularly as we get older, we need to fight to keep our world broad and not let it not let it narrow down. So it's as much for my own mental health as anything else that I do enjoy the immediate deadlines of journalism and having to. That's a lie. I don't enjoy them, but I think it does me good to have things that are due right now, week after week, as well as things that are more nebulous and might take years.
Down the back there,
Okay.
Georgie.
Hello, hi, thanks Malcolm. I haven't yet to read your book. I bought it this morning. I'm very much looking forward to it. I'm curious to know, in the drafting of it and the development and your thinking since, does it contain clues for us around how to resist the strongmen of today and how to avoid just, as you said, putting one foot in front of the other?
Not in the literal plot sense, because well, maybe it does, but yeah. I just don't want to give away the ending, and you probably come out of the book thinking the answer to that question is yes and no, because there are ways in which you can never survive, but there are also side doors by which something even more precious than yourself can survive, and if there's a if there's a moral that arises from the plot, it's that maybe I have to throw myself under the oncoming train so that somebody more valuable than me can survive and carry the baton forward. And this book does actually have a sequel that's coming out next year, and it is about that outcome.
Now you tell us. Could have asked about that.
Yeah. So I'm not a self-help writer, and I'm not somebody who has a manual for survival or the answers to everything, and not even the answers to anything.
Okay, just this gentleman here.
Thank you, Malcolm. It's been a fascinating discussion and gone on a long time, but I'm still a little bit confused about what the actual book is about, in the sense that it's called The First Friend. So how does that all fit together, whether you've got a wife and kids or whatever? Because I'm just a little, sort of jumped along a fair bit.
Yeah, I'm afraid you have to read. You've got to... So the friend is the term friend. I'll just take the title. Everybody calls each other friend. That's my transliteration of what we often think of as comrade in Russia. So it's friend Stalin, friend Beria, friend Vasil, and so on. And I wanted to, kind of mix up what a friend is. Is a friend a title? The first friend, it could be Stalin because he's at the top of the pyramid. The first friend could be Beria because he's really the boss of the book. The first friend could be Murtov because he's Beria's first and last friend, and Beria, strangely enough, relies on this illusion of friendship as much as anybody. What's the book about? In a nutshell, it's about the big boss is arriving in town and everybody goes nuts. And that's my one sentence pitch.
I think there was a question over here.
It's sort of carrying on, following on from the question you got earlier. When you wrote the book, were you seeing what happened in Georgia and Soviet Russia under Stalin as a parallel somewhat, or was the genesis of that story because of finding something historical that you thought was fascinating? And following on from that, I mean, obviously, I don't know what the history was it was a peasant history that predated the Soviet Revolution, but our living now and the policing of language within Soviet Russia, of course, or even thought, or nuance, or reflection, were you drawing upon that, like today, where we think of things in terms of polemic, right and wrong, strong men, you know, that exist outside of the context of not so much the men, but those people that follow them because of that well of dissatisfaction, unhappiness, you know, being victims of neoliberalism or whatever. Did you see parallels between then and now that prompted the writing as well? Or?
Well, I do now.
Oh, okay.
Especially, and I will more and more over the next month or so, because those two words, strong and weak, are the only words that you're going to hear between now and the federal election.
Oh, yes, yes.
You know, the humanity's search for strength in times of uncertainty.
Well, they're looking for simplicity,
whatever it is going to be exploited and wrung to the last drop over the next month. So the policing of language, it's, you know, most people I know are what you call progressive, political progressives, who also think that a lot of woke language policing is ludicrous to the point of you know, it's something only.
But it is there as a we're all very aware of it. You know, yes, all of my friends are very liberal as well. But you know, we'll. But, in, you know, in private company, you'll use all sorts of language that.
The policing of language is used by, you know, both sides.
Yeah, both sides.
And all sides, and the kind of the techniques of extreme political correctness are also used by the right. With great delight and maybe with some effect.
Yes, it's a lack of nuance or reflection or looking at things in context. Everything's sort of boiled down to things being simplistic, right and wrong.
Yeah, the first part of your question, look, you do things, and you've heard from David Dyer, who's a wonderful novel about the, you know, Apollo 11 mission, where you think you're doing one thing, and you think you're following your obsession, and then you realise during and certainly after, when you kind of post-morteming your own book, you realise, gee, I was writing about here and now, because it's all got through, and I didn't realise it at the time. I wasn't even thinking consciously about it, but that's how the world gets into you.
Yeah, this book is definitely big magic. You need to go and buy it now, especially before the sequel comes out. Let's give a big hand to Malcolm Knox.
Thank you.